And that's the kind of day it's been.
For Lloyd Robertson, it's been a life serving as the face of news in Canada. In a moment, Lloyd discusses career highlights and reflects on a half-century of change in the news business. Freedom fighter Hamid Gassami Shaul tells Lloyd and Lorna of his release from 5 years on death row in Iran. Then we'll ask Canada's famous anchor why he believes the way you tell a story is more important than you might think. This is Context, a look at life beyond the headlines.
The man you're about to welcome once considered a very different career, being a minister. Well, talk about the path not taken. Instead, he spent 60 years in broadcasting, forging a bond with millions of Canadians. Please welcome Lloyd Robertson to Context. Lloyd, thank you. What an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. So if Reverend Ferguson Barr of St. Andrew's Presbyterian in Stratford, I read the book. If he would have had his way, I think it would have gone, so that's the kind of sermon it's been.
Yes, and I hope they would have been good. I hope they would have been as good as all those years on the news.
You grew up in a little town, and the church was part of shaping your childhood, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. My father insisted that I go with him to church every Sunday. And we had our regular spot in the pews. And then most Sunday nights, I would sit at the dining room table with him, and we'd read from the Bible. I don't remember specifically what we read, but I know that it was mostly the New Testament. And he really informed my life in terms of a spiritual path, I believe.
You put little spiritual truisms all through your biography. How did your dad and his faith shape your life?
Well, my father was not well educated in a traditional sense. I mean, he was a working man, but he was a philosopher king, in my view. I mean, he really seemed to work at understanding the spiritual path that he was following. And he wasn't an ardent Christian, I wouldn't call him that, but he certainly believed that the best way to go through your life was following the golden rule. And certain of the maxims that I picked up along the way, like this too shall pass, was of great service to me later on. So I think that he really was the person, you know, you wonder why you're here and why you're behaving the way you're behaving. I think he was the person who really cast my character. I am serving really in his shadow in so many respects in his life.
Your father didn't just talk the talk, he had quite a walk that he had to walk because his wife, your mother, had severe mental illness, OCD, paranoia. By the time you were 14, she had the radical surgery of a lobotomy.
Right.
Tell me how that marked your life.
Well, I remembered all that vividly because in those days I can recall the problems at home. I could never invite my friends in. In those days, you could not talk about mental illness. I mean, you think the stigma is bad now, try 50, 60 years ago, because it was thick then. And people who were mentally ill were discriminated against in a way that we wouldn't even think about today. You know, they were non-persons. They had to be hidden away because they made people uncomfortable. And I remember going to the mental hospitals, walking through those walls, seeing people frozen in catatonic states, hearing the cries from the locked wards, and then going to see my mother. And my mother, she was an intelligent woman, and I believe that with all the changes in mental health today, with all the availabilities of various therapies and through drugs and meditation and what have you, I think she might be functioning very well today. But in those days, she was so totally dysfunctional that they felt the only possibility for her was a lobotomy. And my father was very loath to agree to that, but he ultimately did. And I didn't hear about it for a long time because I think he was ashamed to tell me, because he was way ahead of his time in terms of mental illness. I mean, he used to say to me, be kind to your mother, be considerate. And it was very difficult for me because I was embarrassed. I was ashamed that someone in our family would have something like that, which was so shunned by society. He said, she has an illness. She could have cancer, she could have diabetes, she happens to be mentally ill. Wow, was he ever ahead of his time? I mean, we're talking late 40s, early 50s here, and he was talking to me that way then. Imagine.
What do you think now about the culture of tell all? Always. I mean, we're twittering it, whatever, it's all out there.
In that sense, it's probably too much. But I felt in doing this book that, and my friends who had written books all said to me, if you're going to do a book, you've got to be honest with people, because the expectation is going to be that you're going to talk about not just your victories and the good times, you're going to talk about the bad times and the struggles as well. And it took me a long time to decide to write about my mother, because I couldn't imagine what she would have thought had she known that her son was going to write a book and her story would perhaps be read by millions of people across the country. What would she think? I know at the time she would have been horrified. I've since dealt with that in my own way, and I write a closing chapter in the book about that. But it was very difficult to broach those years. But I really do believe that on the mental health side, it's much better that we're talking about it now, more openly than we ever have before, because it was in the shadows for such a very long time.
You also write glowingly about your wife, Nancy. A lot of people would think the sharp-elbowed world of the newscaster, to be able to protect your family life like you did. You went home many times for supper in between, like start the shift, going to read the late night news, but you squeezed home in between. Great daughters. How did you hold that family life together in all of the travels, in all of the pressures?
Well, I can't say it was easy all the time, because it wasn't. It wasn't easy for Nancy. It wasn't easy for me. But we worked at it. And I think that in any marriage, that's what you have to do. If you love one another and you want to stick together, then you work at it.
Things have changed so much in how the newsman tells the story. In a moment, we're going to talk with a Canadian-held man who was captive in Iran. And he's able to be here because news changed and the way we develop news changed. So stay with us. Social media drove the publicity of that story, and we're going to find out how Lloyd Robertson handles a story that was moved forward, not through the news reader, but through news activism that happens through people like you and I. Okay, joining us now is Sheldon Neal, whose odds of ever winning a Lloyd Robertson lookalike contest are fairly slim. Sheldon.
Oh, Lorna, another dream shattered. That's so brutal. Well, let's unpack the T word a bit and ask you at home, how much do you trust the news you see and hear each day? Is it sometimes, half the time? Maybe it's almost all the time. From your feedback, we'll be making a random draw, and one of you will win a copy of Lloyd's book, That's the Kind of Life It's Been. So please send us an email, call us, or reach us by Twitter or Facebook. Get going.
Okay, we'll return in a moment with Lloyd Robertson and two very special guests, Hamed Ghasemi Sal and his spouse Antonella Mega. Hamed made headlines recently when he was released from death row in Iran's notorious Evin prison, where he'd been detained and abused since 2008. Stay with us.